So Jahnavi and I will be discussing a lot of topics, but we thought we'd use two new books as a jumping off point. One of them, I have both of them here. One of them is a book by Carl Zimmer called She Has Her Mother's Laugh, The Powers, Perversions, and Potential of Heredity. The other one is a book by Angela Saini. It's called Inferior, The True Power of Women and the Science That Shows It. So before we start on the actual science topics, I just wanted to ask Jahnavi, based on her interactions with both scientists and people with non-science backgrounds, what she thinks the role of popular science books like these are, how they open up the conversation, and whether certain topics lend themselves to this kind of popular science, whereas others may or may not.
Hello? Yeah, great. So, what do I think about books like these, and whether what do they do? So, the mission, I think, of books like Carl Zimmer's or Angela Saini's work is no different to the mission that we have for the Science Gallery, for example. And the sentence I like to use best to describe the activity that these books, as well as the gallery, would do is scripting science back into culture. So I think we've spent about the last 100 odd years scripting science out of culture, in a sense, where it's become, while it remains a social enterprise, it's increasingly seen as so exclusive because of institutional boundaries, because of other sort of, the kind of cultural authority that science has garnered, that we find it increasingly outside of normal public debate. And so books like these put science back into the domain, back into a domain where public debate is possible. They can contribute to increasing, in a sense, to use a bad phrase, but nonetheless I'll use it, which is to increase the level or the quality of the debate that we can actually have in the public domain about science, what it means to our lives, etc. Now, in terms of the kind of topics that are better addressed by books such as these and not, I am a historian of 20th century physical sciences, primarily, not of the biological or life sciences. And I find, say, for example, that that sciences which have a more direct social interface, so medical sciences, life sciences, where questions that are being addressed have a very, very direct impact on people's lives, have greater potential to become popular science books, for lack of a better phrase, or books which are grounded in research but speak to an audience which is not of practicing scientists. It is not just as easy to do it. For example, my own work has been on the beginnings of experimental nuclear physics or aerodynamics, aeronautics. You very quickly find yourself addressing a bunch of geeks or nerds or a niche audience who's either fascinated by planes or some mad people sort of completely fascinated by cyclotrons. I'm one of them. But those topics, for example, don't lend themselves easily to a book of this kind. Like, She Has Her Mother's Laugh. There's nobody in this audience to whom the title will not speak. Fast rotating particles being smashed open to study the nucleus. The nucleus being smashed to study the particles doesn't speak just as easily.
So, of course, these topics everybody can relate to because we see our parents, we see our ancestors. But I'll tell you a few interesting facts in this book if you manage to read it. And maybe in question and answer session we can touch upon some of them. For example, things you may not have heard of. The fact that humans actually mated with Neanderthals. The fact that babies can actually have 3 parents. Or the fact that an unborn baby can actually transfer genes from its father to its mother. And therefore the mother actually then becomes a chimera of all the children she's ever had. These are the kinds of things which we've actually known for many decades, but somehow it hasn't really reached the popular consciousness. This is the level of knowledge we have about heredity and the molecular basis. But what I want to ask Jahnavi to do now is to see whether any particular topics in these books and more broadly in the subject of genes and destiny are things that she would like to focus on, and then we can open up the conversation.
Absolutely. So, my own entry into the history of the life sciences, or even trying to understand things from the life sciences, was a lecture I once heard by a molecular biologist called Mark Brown, where he started out by saying that nearly 99% of the human genome maps on to that of a chimpanzee. Now, the rest that followed after that was something I wasn't familiar with, which is that 50% of the human genome maps on to a banana. And 25% of the human genome maps onto a daffodil. So what is the meaning of gene mapping or so gene sequencing and genome mapping, and how so on the one hand our efforts to map the gene or map the human genome has rendered incredible amounts of data. On the other hand, the meanings of this mapping is something that is not necessarily obvious even to people like myself who are at least somewhat on the border between science and culture.
Yeah. So these numbers are things, it's another case where sort of technology has run far ahead of our ability to vocalize it. We don't have the language to describe it. So the idea that 50% of our genome maps to a banana, it's not that I look 50% banana and 50% human. So when we say 99% or 59%, you should think of genes as a program. And you should think of this 99% kind of number as the sort of underlying operating system in a computer. It's the bit you never see, it's the bit that keeps everything working. But what makes sort of your desktop different from somebody else's are the few extra programs that you've added to personalize your computer, right? And that could be as small as 1% or 0.1%, and still make all the difference. So I'll just highlight the differences between all living humans, all put together. So our genomes are about 3 billion bases. And out of those 3 billion bases, there's 10 million sites, okay, which is the sites at which we all differ from one another. So it's sort of 0.003% of the genome. And those are the little sites that make you uniquely you and make somebody else uniquely somebody else. It's using those sites that we trace our human ancestry, the peopling of the world, and so on. At that level, actually, humans and Neanderthals were 99.7% identical. And in fact, today's European population have 3% Neanderthal genomes. In fact, and many of those genomes help them fight local infections and so on. These are all very recent findings about how genes can mix up. Okay, so don't worry too much about 50% banana, but do worry about the things that make you unique. So if you read your own DNA, those are the things that are more informative.
So I'm glad you bring that up, because this is the thing, right? We are saying that we can, in a sense, read the human genome. We can sequence our genes. What is, what can you say further to that in terms of where research is taking us?
So when the first human genome was sequenced, so the 1990s, there was a big human genome project, and the human genome sequence cost several $1 billion to do. Today, you can actually, every one of you can actually get your genome sequenced for under $1,000 or less. So the question is, what should one do with that information? So in fact, in Zimmer's book, one of the chapters, it's called Individual Z or Individual Z, he gets his genome sequenced, and then he meets all the best geneticists and genomic scientists that he can find to say, what do I do with this information? Now, one of the obvious things that we have been doing for a long time is to find these rare mutations that cause disease. So when you have a child that has a rare mutation, for example, that causes a nutritional deficiency, if you knew that before they were born, you can actually supplement the nutrition from the day they're born and they live perfectly healthy lives. So these are the kinds of things we're able to do. The problem is that very few genes in our genomes have these simple one-to-one mappings, that you have this genetic variant, it makes this particular difference. Unfortunately, some of those very one-to-one genes also correspond to very visible characteristics like skin color. Okay, so the fact that you have these very few genes in your body that are these one-to-one mappings are in fact the basis of the kind of racism and so on, scientifically misjustified eugenics that made the 20th century misuse of science such a horrible thing. The entire Nazi program, in fact, even in the United States, there was a government-sponsored eugenics effort to purify the human population and make it better. You can't do that. Most of the things that make us human involve thousands of genes. And we all have many, many different copies. And every human comes out as completely different. So for me, if I were to sequence my own genome, I would do it to see if I had very specific rare genetic disorders. Other than that, I maybe print a picture of it and frame it on the wall, and there's nothing I can do with it today. It's not that I would know anything more about that other than what I can just see through my own growing up or through a child's actual life.
Right. So in a sense, what you're saying is that the information that you can get from a person in situ or in person is probably far more reliable, far more informative than the information that you can get from a genome map.
Yes.
Right. So I'll try to ask you a historical question, use my prerogative as historian of science and ask you, which is that, and this is something you alluded to just now, and colleagues of mine who are working on the history of heredity, which is that we've understood heredity very differently until the gene, in a sense, came along, right? It inhabited the domains of law, of medicine, madness. And we have this story of Charles Darwin going nuts because he was married to his first cousin, and at that point of time, his cousin, among others, Galton, his other cousin, Galton, who he wasn't married to, were showing how, for example, generating statistics on madness and inheritance, right? So, so in this context, what we have is inheritance is populated, if you like, or described or constituted very differently from the gene and how we've arrived at. So, how would you, as someone, or how would scientists practicing in this domain understand the residues of these previous understandings, the definitiveness of the current understanding, and is there a way to see, say, for example, is there any uncertainty around it? How does this affect, right? So, in terms of what history brings to the current debate, where would it take?
So I'll start with the definitiveness. The current understanding, of course, it's not definitive, but we've actually shown definitively that there are limits to what the genome can tell us now and forevermore. So we now understand the limits of what heredity can tell us as about our own future. But about the historical context, it seems to me that the 2018 now has a lot of parallels with the early 1900s. Even back then, there was a scientific burst to the molecular understanding of heredity, not about DNA, but the fact that it had something to do with cells and plasm. And that understanding got very quickly co-opted by non-scientists, by other social forces, which led to these, to eugenics and, various, and the institutionalization of the feeble-minded and various other things. It seems to me we're living through a very parallel time where people's DNA sequences are being misused. In the front page of the papers, there are advertisements for things, total scams called genohomeopathy, which have no scientific basis, but market forces are fetishizing DNA and forcing us to reckon with what that means about who we are. Going back further in the past, it's funny that a lot of the early secrets of heredity came through madness running in royal families.
Yes.
Now, why does madness run in royal families? It's because of these recessive genes. But, that's a very mechanistic thing. Why did royal families think it was healthy to intermarry cousins generation after, or even uncles and nieces, generation after generation of generation, when they could see the degradation of their own health? It was purely for the purposes of inheritance of property. So we link up this biological thing to this very legal, sociological thing. It's
Absolutely.
mysterious. The other thing is, this is a discussion that's still going on. There was a time when it wasn't clear whether the information, of course, we know parents look like their children, but whether the information came from the mother or the father. For a long time, the idea was that the mother is just the soil and the father is the seed. And of course, the fact that it's 50-50 is a completely new phenomenon, which we've only now verified molecularly. It had to wait till now to say that the mother and the father are equal contributors to their child's genetic inheritance.
And I think that's what Angela does wonderfully in her book, sort of bringing out how research, in a sense, has undermined and constantly information has been used to say again and again that somehow women were inferior. So, there's one more question that I wanted to ask you, which is that now that we can read the genome, there is also the possibility, or there's also a possibility under consideration of rewriting the genome. Which again brings us back into the cultural domain, right? So while we started with inheritance and heredity being sort of flip sides of the same coin, we are now back into that domain where the rewriting of the genome puts us back into socio-cultural domain with legal implications, etc. So how do you relate to it as a researcher, and what is your reading of Carl Zimmer, for example, saying anything about it?
Okay, so first of all, my own research doesn't touch upon rewriting DNA. I study things that happened billions of years in the past, but there are many people in Bangalore and of course around the world who do this kind of work. So I will talk about that. So first of all, even before we had the power to to go into somebody's genome and modify it, we've always had for example, animal breeders have always been selecting certain traits. And the way they select traits is there happens to be, let's say, a cow that has a particularly extreme body mass, and so that cow will father many, or that bull will father many more offspring in the next generation. This is a way for certain genes to become propagated. And that's the manner in which the eugenicists wanted to modify our gene pool, is to literally prevent certain people from having children and other people from not having children. What we can do now is something much more direct. We can actually take a sperm or an egg or a fertilized egg or an embryo, and you can actually go in and clip out certain genes and modify them. In, in principle, some of this has already been done specifically to deal with hereditary diseases. So a child has a very specific mutation. But in a country where, for example, not genetic testing, but ultrasound testing for the sex of an unborn embryo has now been used to kill millions of unborn female children. You can only imagine what people would do if they had the market, the ability of companies and market forces to say, you can go and modify your own child's genome, and here's a particular gene that happens to be prevalent in Olympic athletes, right? People would you choose to do this? Would people choose to do this? My feeling is that this will get away with itself, and if the technologies are there, people will choose to use them. Okay, and it's up to us to educate, to inform, and to say why this is wrong. And let me explain why this is wrong. It's wrong because a single gene doesn't define a person, right? It's the entire collection of genes. And so whatever assumptions we have about what genes to clip out and put in are guaranteed to be wrong and mistaken. What we'll end up doing is losing the diversity that makes us interesting, makes us human, makes us survive infectious outbreaks and so on. Diversity is the key to the population. And finally, in fact, if you do... So there is a moratorium now worldwide where we are using these technologies to clip out genes in cells within our body, but not in our sperms and our egg. It means that we've put a moratorium on the germline inheritance of human genetic diversity. You can change genes in your own body, but you can't change what you transmit to the next generation.
Should we now...
I'm happy to take questions. So I think there'll be a lot of technical questions and a lot of social questions, and we have about 5 minutes left, so we could.
Hi. First of all, thanks you for this great talk that you gave. My question is related to something that you were alluding earlier. That was taboos related to the research that goes into genetics, and the kind of discussions we are having all around the world over these kind of subjects. And I would like to ask you, in the present scenario, with respect to the discussion, like for example, Ezra Klein and Sam Harris had on their podcast, and all the kind of things which are happening in West, how would people even have a discussion about these things if there are so much taboo around talking about? And these are not just like right-leaning taboos, there are now left-leaning taboos also arising.
Fine.
How can we have a discussion when the taboos exist?
Yeah, so you are right, and if you can pull it back historically also. So eugenics gave genetics a bad name. So after the middle of the 20th century, after sort of the hollowness of the Nazi ideology was exposed, many scientists sort of walked back their claims about what genetics could do. And for a while, you are right, there was a sort of taboo on doing certain kinds of research. But that was a long time ago. Within the scientific community, these sorts of taboos are not there, unthinking taboos. But there are discussions, broad ethical discussions. So you do have science conferences, for example, where you'll go, there'll be a biochemist speaking, and then there'll be an ethicist speaking in the next session. And there may be a historian of science, right? So the conversations you think are not happening, they are happening. They may not be happening in this kind of venue, and maybe that can change. I don't know if you have a different...
I think it should change. Yeah.
So, how exactly will you regulate the marketplace from misusing the... So, can you give me specific details? Like, because these days I'm seeing like they send emails like, is there like you mentioned about the sporting gene, they had written an article, like 3 articles on that and things like that. So how exactly will you, should the state or scientists regulate that?
I take that.
How do you regulate the market?
It's a difficult one. And I think, frankly, regulation is not the only answer. Although I wouldn't say there should be no regulation. There has to be regulation. But I don't think regulation is the only answer. In fact, a proper debate is a much better answer. Quality debate, an informed debate in society about what this research, but what these things mean to us as human beings, is where the answers will come from. It's unfortunately not going to be only regulation.
So, but you can look at examples. There's a company in the US called 23andMe, which you can give them a swab of your saliva, they'll sequence your genome, send it back to you on a thumb drive, right? And they used to also send an annotation of your genome, saying what you can expect to be and all these kinds of things. So now the laws have changed, where the company is not allowed to do that anymore. They can only flag specific health-related mutations or alleles, but they cannot also add all this gloss about what you may or may not become. People were using this kind of information to judge whether their children might be good athletes. Okay, and let's pick this example. Suppose I send my genome to 23andMe, or I get it sequenced, or my child's genome, and I find there's some variant which is also found among Olympic athletes at more than the general population. What would you do with this information? So it turns out that information, again, is completely useless, because it's much more accurate to get a group of children at the age of 10, make them run the 100-meter dash, see how long they take, and that actual measurement tells you much more than whatever the genetic information could have told you. By publicizing these facts and absurdities, people can then learn to, make these choices, right?
Excuse me, here, on this side. There seems to be a very strong political correctness when we speak about genetics and its stuff. The problem with that is that there's always going to be some rogue nation somewhere. There's always going to be military research going into genetic, biological warfare. And we sit and talk about platitudes, whereas the real danger comes from the periphery, and we're not even aware of it. I think science has a responsibility to consider the extreme cases and to discuss them and bring them out.
Yeah, so that was a comment, and I completely agree with that comment. In fact, let's just talk about biowarfare first, because it's not quite the subject of this discussion. It turns out that the most effective infectious agents are not the ones that were invented by humans, but are just the viruses and bacteria and protists that live in the environment. So it's not that additional genetic engineering leads to any more coherent and deadly threats. Okay, it's just the use of those. So it's outside the purview of the engineering. In terms of the cutting edge and extreme cases, science does take it into account. In fact, if you go to a science conference, you'll be surprised, maybe even shocked, about how far ahead the actual powers that are being discussed and implemented, not in humans, but let's say in mice, are beyond what the policymakers are thinking about are possible outside. To bring it home, very close to home, we now have the power, and that's the last chapter of Zimmer's book, to modify mosquitoes, okay? So that if a male mosquito from the lab mates with a female mosquito from the wild, all her female offspring will be sterile. Okay, so this mosquito now exists, and it's a question about whether we deploy it. Now, the nature of this deployment exactly has to do with these extreme cases. Will it get out? What will happen if it spreads? What are all these outside cases, right? And the discussions are happening. But ultimately, it'll be governments and the society that has to say, we either want this or don't want this. And if it seems to be steamrolled, let's say we're going to do it, you should object and say, I need the information. I need the discussion to happen. But it's also not confined to a single government. As you said, anybody anywhere could choose to do this. It'll modify the whole planet. I think there was a question somewhere else. I don't know where the mic is. Oh, you have a question. Yeah.
You talked about the moratorium for sperm and egg editing. But if a person edits his genes before he mates with a female, that's in effect the same thing. It's passing on the edited genes as sperm.
We don't edit our genes. Each sperm and each egg is a random combination of genes from our parents, purely random. Okay, it's 50-50. So I wouldn't call that editing. I'd call that shuffling. Question there. Please jump in.
Hi, Mukund.
Hello.
Can you make a silk purse out of a sow's ear?
Okay, so are you talking about human improvement? If you are, as I said, what we don't understand, so we know that DNA influences who we are, okay? What we don't understand is that language, but what the particular sequence does to our particular phenotypes, and in many cases, in principle, there are limits on to how much we can map. But let's not talk about humans. We have done huge amounts of crop improvement, livestock improvement, this is modified mosquitoes and so on. So the idea of improving is not something, one disagrees with. The thing one disagrees with is government intervention about reproductive choices people can and cannot make. Right? You're free to make your own choices given complete information. Does that address some of your questions? If you're talking about improvement, we're allowed to do it. There is some science behind it. But improving, for example, average human intelligence, let me tell you, it has happened. Human intelligence has improved on IQ tests, leaps and bounds over the 20th century. And it was not because of genetics, it was because of nutrition. Okay, it was because of nutrition, which everybody can have access to.
Okay, Mukund, question here. Question on history and genetics. I've been following, David Reich, Oppenheimer's, and others, and particularly interested to know, given the state of genetics that we have, how reliably can we say where we come from? There's a lot of debate, for example, about M17 and the genetic side of history.
Okay. I'll take that question. I'm going to hand it over to Jahnavi just to say one thing. There was a court case where in the US where a woman's child did not match her DNA, and the court thought that she had stolen the child. And then the court sent an officer to witness the birth of her next child. The next child also did not match the DNA, even though it came from inside her. The court prioritized the DNA evidence over the court officer's own evidence and said, this is not your child, even though it came out of you. So this is the level of absurdity one can take. I want to ask Jahnavi, how can we say that genetic evidence tells us where we came from? Is that even a reasonable question to ask?
Short answer is no. Based on the work that my colleagues have done in the history of the life sciences. And I think this is where my earlier question to you came from, which is that we've understood heredity, we've understood origins of life, we've understood the evolution of life in very, very different ways across the centuries. And since we kind of started taking deep historical knowledge about humanity seriously, right? And therefore, there are various concepts that have been mobilized to explain this. And some of these we spoke about, which is, inheritance and madness, generations, breeding. These are words that earlier explained what the gene now purports to explain, right? And therefore, in that sense, as a historian, while we stand with our back to the future, as we always do, where will this phase fit into what might come after, and how might we ask questions of this phase is something that my colleagues are doing, and therefore the short answer would remain no.
Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground, and this monitor is flashing time's up, so I think you can catch both of us. We'll be wandering around here if you have any more questions. I do urge you to read both these books, extremely well written popular science books. Inferior by Angela Saini, She Has a Mother's Laugh by Carl Zimmer, David Reich's book was mentioned. There are many others. We're living in a golden age of popular science, so please do engage with this kind of literature and enter into these kinds of conversations. Thank you, Jahnavi. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mukund.